So yeah, good evening and welcome to Juxtapositions, the second event of the public lecture series of the Studium Generale here at the Berlin University of Arts on the topic of contemporary cultural production. This lecture series aims at a very broad and kind of cross-disciplinary audience within the school and actually beyond the school. It aims to kind of rattle the cages of convention and aims to refuse any, let's say, disciplinary coherence. And it promotes a more, let's say, more wild thinking. First of all, I would like to thank you and those of you guys that are watching online now for the immense feedback that we got already from last week's first session. We have, I think, now 225 students registered to this course, which is immense. We had 180 people following online, and we have about 20 to 30 people now in the room. So this is great. Thank you. I've also been reading all the comments, and I will give feedback too. But it's beautiful to see that there's obviously a need and an interest in these more kind of transdisciplinary attempts here at the school. And I would also like to before I introduce our lecturer today, give a huge applause and congratulations to all of you for the last couple of days. We had the open days here at the University of Arts, and it was incredible. I've been here, I think, every day, and to see the kind of work, the wide range of work at the school has been deeply, deeply inspiring to me. So thanks for that. Respect, chapeau, and keep up the great work. But now to tonight's topic, Oana. Thank you so much for being here with us today. It's a very special guest to me, and I'm very, very grateful for you coming to be with us. So, Oana Stănescu is an architect from Romania originally and a designer who is building, thinking, writing, and designing. Her work is what she calls an undisciplined collection of projects across various sizes, programs, and collaborators. Always very humble, very low-key about her work. She's actually a heavy hitter. So she has been working on the most incredible projects over the course of her career. Based in New York and quite recently in Berlin, you traveled the world. Currently, you're reconverting a half-kilometer-long disused rail structure in your hometown in Romania. You're designing and building a very long house or a longhouse in Canada, and you work on an installation for a music festival. As an architect, you have worked with all the great offices before. You've worked in Tokyo for Sana, in New York for Rex, and in Basel for Herzog de Meuron. And then eventually under the moniker Family New York, which you founded with Dongping Wong, you created numerous outstanding projects. From a cross-shaped public swimming pool in New York's East River to the set design for Kanye West Yeezus tour, as well as a number of Off-White stores for Virgil Abloh, the later also being a longtime collaborator of yours. But you also have been teaching from the get-go. You taught at the AA. You're currently running a course or workshop called Non-Professional Practice at Harvard GSD. That aims to study unconventional modes of architectural practice and their underlying implications. By the way, there's this beautiful video clip on the GSD site by Benedict Cumberbatch reciting Sol Levit. And that's, for those of you that haven't seen it, go to the site Non-Professional Practice at GSD. It's a beautiful clip. And at MIT, you're co-running a research studio called Blueprints of Justice that investigates the future for the hybrid virtual and physical spaces of justice. The later another project, amongst others, with Abloh on board. So all of that said, I'm thrilled, I'm honored, and I'm really, really excited to have you here with us today as part of the Juxtapositions public lecture series at the Berlin University of the Arts. Welcome, Oana Stănescu.
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
It's never not gonna be uncomfortable to hear that those kind of introductions, but thank you for your generosity and thank you for having me. Let's see, can we make this work? No, maybe. Okay, thanks all for coming tonight. It's probably the first lecture in like 1.5 years or something like that. The last one was in a school. The last one was at UCLA, end of February 2020, so right before the end of the world. And I find it to be a very strange time to lecture, and I know I can't do necessarily what I did before. I mean, a lot of those lectures just live online anyway. But it's such a strange time, just to say the obvious. And I'm very sort of, I think, skeptical in a way skeptical about anyone who is a little bit too certain on their steps, and anyone who kind of, pretends they know what they're doing, frankly. Because if we've seen anything in this, past 1.5 years, I know we're in this weird spot where it's like, it's kind of normal, but did we really process what was happening? What did actually happen? What is happening? All these things are so much on my mind. All of this to say that I wanted to do, well, one, I was asked to talk about the range of the work and the range of the whole different kind of aspects of my work. So, and I tried to create a bunch of buckets, and I realized there aren't that many buckets. There's a single bucket, and I'm the bucket. So it's a bit of a kind of messy presentation in that sense. But the other thing too, I didn't want to just tell you, the glorious version or the kind of pretty images and this is what it is and awesome, but kind of tell you the nuance of things, but also give you something in a way. So I'm also going to present things that are kind of in process or kind of in the works, things that I'm trying out, things that I'm experimenting with, and I'd love your feedback at the end on that too. And so I feel it was important to me to, in a way, try to establish more of a conversation, even if I am at the podium standing with echo too. Okay, so I tried to look back and kind of understand what's the one constant thing throughout my practice that did not wasn't shaken in the last couple of years. Maybe the way I practice, maybe the kind of work I want to do, certain aspects definitely were shaken up. But the one thing that never changed actually was really just the kind of, and it's going to sound extremely banal, but it's really just the joy and the sheer sort of excitement about the work. So I'm going to start actually at the first project, which I've done almost 2 decades ago. It hurts. But so this was, I grew up and I studied architecture in Romania. I was from the western part of Romania, tiny town, 100,000 people. No one knows about it. Beautiful place, but I think I hadn't been to a museum of contemporary art or a museum of art probably until I was 19 and got into architecture school, and I think we visited Venice or something like that. It's kind of, I don't know why that matters or not, it's kind of just a weird benchmark for me to kind of understand that half of my life I did not have access to a whole universe. But then I got into architecture school, and this was the first project that we had to do. So we had to learn how to dimension and draw a room, and this was the room that I was living in at the time. It was a standard Plattenbauten, coincidentally square room. So we had to take this space, learn how to draw it, learn how to dimension it, and turn it into a place. These are not the actual drawings. I don't know that they still exist somewhere. We had to do everything by hand at the time. So we had to take a space and turn it into a place, so give it meaning, giving a function. For the ones of you that aren't architects, this is a plan view of basically what I turned into a place of isolation. I did not know that we were all going to isolate for a little bit longer than desired, but this was totally emo post-high school vibes. And so this is the plan, and it just shows kind of this spiraling space, the space getting narrower and narrower and smaller until you're able to kind of get into that little sort of wooden place where you get also a little bit of light from the view and can be happy by yourself. I actually, the panels that I did for this project did have smiley faces, sad face at the beginning, then happy face when you're there in your corner. I'm glad they don't exist anymore. But the one thing, the reason I wanted to show this and the reason I kind of went all the way back is this thing kind of blew my mind, or what blew my mind really was understanding that you can take something from deep inside of you, a feeling, an affect, something that makes you feel weird, something that you might not want to share explicitly with anyone, something that's yours and yours only, and turn it into something, like give it life, give it meaning, materialize it, allow it to live outside of you. And once I realized that, and hence the kind of, it's like there was such an excitement to the possibilities to kind of try to make sense of the world through these tools that I think that joy did not cease no matter what else happened, and many things have happened. I still think our jobs as architects that's one of the hardest things, and that is actually to take abstract elements, whether it's affect or program or feelings or desires, pleasures, things like that, and turn them into concrete physical spaces. I think it's not an easy job, but I think it's also the most exciting part of it. So I'll go through some of these projects. Some were done as family and some are individual. They span across a range of types of architecture. I don't know that that model of, let's say, a residential or cultural architect is still very much present, but just going through a few of them, this was competition. Early on we did a bunch of competitions. It's a good way to build your portfolio, to kind of also train your muscle, to have to learn to kind of just, you know, make your choices, stand for something. Basically, in between, what happened in between here and here was about, let's say, 5 to 6 years of working in different places around the world for different people. And it was my way of getting a second education, but also visiting the world. So I always tried to find a place where an office that I was interested in, and then a place that I was interested in, and kind of see if it works. That's one of the coolest things about architecture. A lot of the kind of cultural, let's say, creative industries is that it was very much based on portfolio. It didn't matter that I studied in a tiny town that no one knew, but really you were hired just based on the portfolio. So these were some of our first projects. This is a museum for contemporary art in Maribor in Slovenia, with a very busy ground floor, basically extroverted towards the city, in order to enable for a kind of very quiet and completely empty second floor for the art space above, kind of showing its presence. Another one was Gosta Serlachius. It was a competition for a museum of art in Finland, and there's a couple of buildings there. It's this very Finnish, typical Finnish landscape, extremely beautiful. And this building over here, do I have a mouse? I do not have a mouse. This building over here was the current museum of art. And there's a couple of few other buildings you're going to see. There's a garage, there's a sauna. Every public building in Finland has a sauna, which is awesome. And a few other buildings. So what happened is what happens in many museum extensions around the world. The required area they need are so big that you would end up with a monster building next to this kind of beautiful, you know, traditional architecture in this really pristine landscape. So what we wanted to do instead was create an architecture that enables you to experience the site just as you would experience the art, and not separate it to experiences, but also not belittle in a way the architecture that's on the site. So again, this is just a plan showing all the programs spread out, and this is a section that shows you how the new building would hug the old one and also work with the many changes in the site, really just allowing for this sort of natural meandering through the site and the aerial view, where you see the landscape a little bit better. I dabbled a little bit in stage design along some really amazing people, and I think one of my kind of most mind-bending moments more recently was the Coachella poster, where they always write the name of the artist at the bottom, but to be on the same poster with Rage Against the Machine was just like kind of trippy and sent me all the way back to high school. I don't know we're redoing Coachella, so hopefully 22, if the world still exists by then. I'm not sure who or you know what the context for that work will be, what the lineup will be. Another project recently done for MoMA PS1 in New York was an invited competition for the Young Architects program there. And I invited a dear friend, Akane Moriyama. She's a fabric artist with an architecture background. You should look her up, really beautiful work. And I wanted to work with her. I kind of realized, and I'll talk about it a little bit more further down the road, that architecture can be really a good excuse to have conversations with people. And I really liked her work, and I wanted to do something together. What was important to me, this was 2019, so the world was in a slightly different place at the time. And what was important to me is so many of these installations that are done on a yearly basis on a tiny budget, they're very self-important usually and very much about themselves. But this is the scene where there's every Saturday, there's a DJ set, and it's a place where you go and feel old because it's New York and it's most alive, and it's a bunch of young people and just having a good time, and it's kind of a crazy, awesome party and a very lively place. And it seemed very counterintuitive to do something that speaks against that, but I wanted to do something that would kind of participate into that, let's say, fun, hence the title of it. So this is MoMA PS1 in its context. It's a former school. So what we wanted to do is very much work with the resources that were given, but both budget-wise, but also the actual architecture. So all those little holes that you see there in the model, those are existing holes in the concrete walls. We wanted to suspend basically on the concrete walls of the courtyard a three-dimensional grid of fabric. In the large courtyard on the right, it's orange and or red and yellow. In the back, it's yellow and blue, and then in the little space over here, there was a hammock, and there were all colors coming together. But there was an additional element that would come into this. On the fabric, there were these mobiles, we call them, hanging. They're very abstract forms, and really the idea was that as you engage with them, you could sit on them, you could climb on them, you could jump on them, you could do all sorts of things with them. You would create ripples in the fabric. The fabric was really attached just at the top, so it would be completely kind of floating at the bottom. And this is just a 1:2 mock-up, so smaller than the actual scale. But it shows a little bit how many colors you can actually get really by, or like how many variations. The interesting thing to me was that the installation would never be the same. Not 2 moments after each other, depending on wind, on your movement, on who engages it one way with the mobiles. It would be constantly alive, constantly changing, also because of the sun and the clouds and so on and so forth. So you'd see something that would never be twice the same. And it would be something that also would change. You could participate in changing and allow it to change with you. But it would also change a little bit the rules of the game. It's a little bit like a playground. It was a very kind of loud moment in time where everyone was just yelling at each other. I don't know that we're in a very different place right now. But I wanted to see if we could create a space in which people can engage socially through different rules. And that's why I mean the playground, because in a playground you have to negotiate. Am I going on the same swing? Am I going on the same set? Have I touched someone's hand? How do I interact? How do we engage with this? You know, there's curiosity, there's teasing. The elements are very abstract. They don't speak. They're not prescriptive. They don't tell you what to do, but they tease and they invite and they kind of open opportunities rather than kind of try to limit them. Just the last shot. Did a bunch of more commercial projects. This was, for example, for Need Supply, which actually, you know, it's the opposite maybe of the room of isolation, where it was a store. So it's a place that comes from Richmond, Virginia, for which the local community was very important. It was actually an online retailer. We had a lot of clients or collaborators that way that had an online presence, did not require a physical presence, but wanted to make a physical presence in order to be able to meet face-to-face the people that actually formed their community. And I think that's interesting, especially in the context of the last 1.5 years or 2 years, where we really realized, hopefully, how important physical space is, how important human connection, human interaction is. So in this case, what we did is we put the women's line all the way at the very top, the men's line at the bottom, and allow the main space to really just be a huge gathering space. I think one of the exciting things to me in architecture is how limited we are as humans, what we do. We sit, we stand, we lie. That's kind of about it. So in order to allow for people to gather, for things to happen, you actually don't really need much. So that was what was quite exciting. We treated the two sides rather differently. This was the opening night. So that allows, of course, for people to gather, but also curation of products and also just space to try things on, read magazine, etc. Similarly, Fool's Gold is a record company in New York. They also just wanted a space to interact with people, but did not need it from a business perspective. This is the night view of the store, the day view. And of course, a lot of projects done for Virgil Abloh. This was the very first Off-White store in Hong Kong, many years ago, and what was fascinating is it was in a very typical commercial shopping street next to all the big brands you can imagine. But we knew in a way that we couldn't compete. No, people didn't really know Off-White at the time, and you couldn't compete with all these big brands in terms of shop window and what you would display. So we wanted to do something different. It was important to us to respond to the local circumstances. That's why you see to this day all Off-White stores being very individual. But we also wanted to do something generous. So what we convinced them to do was actually push the front door all the way from here in the front to the back and give up 1/3 of the floor space to this quote-unquote garden with a bench, where you could just go and sit there without any pressure to look at product, to buy anything, so on and so forth. it's kind of a miracle for something like that to happen in the commercial world, in the sense that this was only possible because Virgil kind of understood it and made it happen. I think that's a lot of that is happening in the, let's say, retail world, because people want, everyone wants the Apple Store or whatever. But people want something different, but without being able or willing to take the risks. But if you follow the traditional models, of course, of retail space, it's all how much dollar can I put on each square footage. And this goes against it. You're kind of throwing away a third of your floor space. But you're doing it with a purpose. And I don't know, things worked out for Virgil, I would say. Just a few more. This was the Singapore store. Here too, we tried to contrast the kind of architecture of the space, which is there's a lot of glass and very shiny and new everything. We're going to create this quiet space. This was a place in Tokyo, and a few more. Also doing residential architecture, currently building a house under construction in Canada, in this really pristine, really amazing natural environment. You almost don't see any other physical built space from there. If there was an image to kind of maybe illustrate it, conceptual image to maybe illustrate it best, I think this would be it. It's such a glorious space that really what we wanted for the architecture to be minimal and really just allow a 360 view no matter where you are, but also allow this duality between the northern and the southern side of this hill. You can say the house is right here, it's on a hill. One's going, looking north and south. And you know how from the south you always get the sun, from the north you get kind of even light. You all know that very well. So we wanted to create a space where you don't have to, you're not in one room and really are longing to be in the sun or in the other one, but the room allows you to negotiate those things, while the architecture also just helps you frame the view and therefore see it. If you look at everything at once, you sometimes don't see the little parts. And this is the plan, probably not very visible. We call it the long house for obvious reasons. It's a very long house. And which was actually the result partially because of planning regulations, because it's a protected area. You have to build you can only build in certain places. And it has a day area, a night area, and a pool, swimming pool in between. The wall that frames the view, that also separates spaces, also holds program, allowing all sorts of different functions within its architecture. It speaks a little bit about process. One thing that I do like too about something like this, so this house we've been working on for over 2 years now. And what you see here are a sequence of physical models. Actually, the one in the front is probably the most recent one. The first one after is the concept one, and then kind of you can grow in stage. It's a little bit what happens is you have a good idea in the beginning, and then as many of you know with your own projects too, the more time you give it and the more input there comes, whether it's from contractors, collaborators, whether it's just the next level of detail, the next resolution, the next resolution, the next resolution, the project kind of grows and starts having a dimension and a life, a depth that you could never have it at the beginning. So I really kind of appreciate time, how time comes into projects, but then also how collaboration and how additional sort of input, the kind of reality sort of comes into it and allow it to become itself. I mean, architecture is painful, it's difficult, fun too, but it really is the result of negotiating so many just incredible parameters. A couple of those views from further down the line that show how the wall negotiates different parts. More on the public side, this is a bridge, also for a competition, a footbridge in Maribor. It was part of the same competition with the first museum I showed, and it's kind of dumb in many ways because it's the longest endless footbridge. They really just wanted a straight line, a very simple bridge, right? The bridge is always the shortest distance between 2 points. But what we realized pretty quickly was that it was a pretty special place, and the interesting place was to be actually on the water. The shores, as you can see, are very thin. There's not much room for a program or for activity there or to really generate something. So we realized actually the place is on the water, not the ends. So we created this circle bridge that allowed us to also engage with the steel traffic bridge on the right side. And it seems like a fairly simple project. It is maybe a fairly simple project. Actually, for a bridge, it's more complicated than maybe necessary. But I also really appreciate, in this case, the structural drawings. And I do just want to point out, especially for the non-architects, the kind of amount of work that is necessary to get to something seemingly simple, or to get something seemingly simple to actual work. This is the column grid that you see, but in a drawing you actually can see how the circles of the bridge also kind of expand and contract, allowing for different, very specifically orchestrated places to hang out, to see a view, to experience certain things. At the bottom you can see there's also, it kind of goes up and down. You had to allow for spaces for small boats to go under. Lateral oscillation. I just love how goofy these things are, but they're 100% structural engineering at its finest. And really, but that entire effort is really to allow people to experience the bridge itself, and not just as a throughway, as a passageway, but really as a place in itself, and to just be on the water. And speaking of the water, just going to briefly touch on the Plus Pool too. It's a collaborative project, also with Dongping Wong, Archie Lee Coates, and Jeffrey Franklin. And it's a project that we started a decade ago. We keep saying a decade, but I think because we stopped counting at a decade, so I think it's going to stay a decade for a substantial amount of time. It's a plus-shaped Olympic swimming pool that filters the river water in the East River in New York. It's really just like as if you were to take an Olympic-sized swimming pool, cut it in the middle, and just flip things onto itself. And why four pools allow you to really address the different conditions that a pool necessarily typically needs to address to. We're always joking that we want to make all New Yorkers happy, which is not really possible, but one can try. So we have on the left side the kids pool, on the right side you have a lounge pool, the lab pool, and then a sports pool that come together into this plus-shaped pool. Of course, it's reminiscent of the Manhattan grid. And you know, the waterfront scene in New York used to be really lively and really rich. But because of pollution, basically the former waterfront river baths, have been closed down in the last 100 years. And that's really unfortunate. But that's why the idea with the project was really simple. It gets really hot in the summer, and you just treat the water between the boroughs in New York. Manhattan is an island. The waterfront of New York altogether is huge. But people treat the water like it's a gap between boroughs. It's a kind of necessary evil that you have to go over, rather than something that is actually a wealth and something you can work with. The reason this project took 10 years is, I mean, it's an initiative. It was really just our idea. We put a couple of things out and really kind of just saw, let's see what happens. We made a rendering, we made some books, we made posters, and then we threw it out. And that kind of started having a life of its own. But in parallel to that, I do want to show again this other dimension of the architectural world, which is how do you build something, or how do you do something that hasn't been done before? So what you see here, this pathway to the pool, is a very optimistic sort of choose your own adventure of how you could potentially permit something that hasn't been done before. The problem is it's not a boat, it's not a building. So what is it, and who blesses it, right? For anyone who broke any rule ever, you kind of have an understanding what this means at the kind of global infrastructure level. There's no department in New York City and state, so federal, state, city, anything that we don't have to deal with, from Army Corps to Department of Health to Department of Transportation to environmental conservation, so on and so forth. So this is basically, you have a room with like 10 people, lawyers, lobbyists, people who worked for the city, trying to figure out how do we actually get to put this in the water? I'm only saying that because it's fascinating. Is the problem is not so much the design, problem is not it's working, but really the problem in this case, and is in many other cases too, is to try to get code, to try to get cities to kind of catch up with it, and to really navigate this kind of really rigid systems and infrastructures that kind of define our lives and define our cities in many ways, for a good reason too. What happens if you have to basically have a public project for such a long time? You have to keep people constantly excited and engaged with the project. So we kept doing all sorts of projects. This was 2019, I believe, fall of 2019. And it's a slightly smaller outline of the pool. And it's a light sculpture that reveals in real time the quality of the water in the river. So if it's blue, that means the water would be fine enough to swim. If the color is pink, then you shouldn't be swimming. So it was just, on the one hand, it is just like a flag kind of, you know, for people passing on the bridge, for people in the city, just kind of a reminder, you actually could be swimming now. It's just that you don't have the infrastructure for it. And we want to build on that frustration and that anger, so much so that eventually we kind of channel it so that we can actually go for a swim if necessary. So I mentioned earlier that this is what we did, a website, a book, posters. We send them all around to all sorts of people. Arup, one of the largest engineering companies in the world, called us 2 weeks later. I think someone hung up on them, thought it was a prank, but it blew up really quickly, which was really exciting. I think that also doesn't happen oftentimes in architecture, that you have such a direct one-on-one relationship and feedback. And what we then try to do is, okay, well, let's use that, let's work with that. We did 2 Kickstarter campaigns, online funding platforms, raised first $40,000, then $273,000. This is just a reminder, we're fresh out of school, and this is like 4 designers really just kind of trying to make this work. So it's incredible sort of support that we received. And that money was used in order to test and to prove that the filtration can actually work. Again, you have 4 designers trying to figure out the water quality data situation. But we partnered with universities and school and started working on it. The other interesting aspect is also, once you do that, you have to constantly communicate the project to non-architects, to non-artists, to non-designers. You have to communicate to politicians, to swimmers, to communities. And there's a whole kind of universe, that very useful exercise. As architects, we actually rarely ever communicate to just architects. But it was a very humbling and very kind of useful experience in that sense. And just bring it back to basic, the idea is really to have access to something that should by default one have access to, and that is just the river and the natural environment that you're surrounded by. And this project was actually my thesis project, which is kind of strange, but this is my hometown. And that structure over there was built in the 60s. It's an industrial town, steel production, used to have big steel production. And this structure was passing over downtown. This is an old image, and was carrying basically stones from the quarry to the factory. So normally over the hill, it was just very simple columns, but here it was passing the entire downtown. You can see how the city changed. Here is still everything very small. There's a church, tiny houses, city hall over on the left side. But then it kind of, with time, things change, and you still have this giant thing passing over downtown. It was a very present structure, part of your daily life, no matter what, everywhere. There's the name of the town, Resita, there. It's our little Hollywood sign. The letters aren't there anymore, kind of. But I remember what we did in high school. We would climb on it, because it gave you a perspective that you wouldn't have from anywhere else. And it's creepy, actually. It's scary, because it's like not even 3 meters by 30 meters. So it's a very kind of spectacular place in itself. And for my thesis, I said, okay, I don't want to just do something for school and just to get over with it. But what if I do something where I actually can challenge myself and have fun with in the same time? So I proposed this project, and then because the city is fairly small, it remained in the local mythology. And a couple of years ago, the mayor kind of hired me and a local architect to turn it into reality. It raises all sorts of challenges. How do you draw something that's 0.5 kilometer long? How do you think something that's long? How do you think through it? How do you conceptualize it? So on and so forth. Just going through a couple of these things. What we're actually turning it into, and what its purpose is bifold. On the one hand, it is about access to the structure, and really kind of being there and experiencing the city and seeing it from a place like you wouldn't normally. The city, too, is a through space. People drive through the place and go on the mountains, and there's a lot of extreme sports and stuff like that happening. So that's one reason. But the other thing that happens, too, it connects hills and gives access to nature. Although the city is surrounded by nature, you currently cannot just walk up to the hill, which is very strange if you have a dog or kids or whatever. So it does that, but in that process, it also restitches the city together. So it allows for additional public infrastructure, ways of navigating the city that you normally wouldn't be able to navigate, which is really exciting. I really like infrastructure projects, and I like projects that aren't about themselves and really just facilitate different kind of conversations. There's zip lining, bungee jumping. There was the one requirement for City Hall, that there's bungee jumping. And this is just a diagram that kind of shows what you see in the red on the hills are biking path or bike trail path or hiking path that go all the way to the surrounding mountains, which are like almost 1,800 meters, I think, in height. So it's actually a really exciting, tiny piece out of a bigger puzzle that truly allows sort of the regional, maybe, infrastructure there to rethink itself slightly. I'll talk now a little bit about some of the things that I've been doing in teaching or kind of learning in that world. I found it very, I kind of came late to teaching, and I still feel very uncomfortable with the term, actually. I feel I'm more of an instigator, if anything, but I see it as a really great place and counter to the practice to be able to just have conversations and test the limits of certain ideas. This was a lecture that I gave with Something Fantastic in February last year. There's a few links throughout this that I can either email to Lukas or whatever, make accessible, but you can also easily find them online. This was also part of a workshop that we did at Syracuse University. So what you see on the cover, the title cover, are the 3 different fonts. A lot of you already know all of them. But basically what we wanted to investigate was this notion of covering, but in architecture. The notion of covering, let's say if you think of music, is a very standard way of learning how to make music, right? You cover a song and that's how you learn to play an instrument. In architecture, that doesn't quite happen as such. I don't know if you're familiar with, I'm sure you already have 10 songs in your mind, 10 covers in your mind. When it comes to music, I think there's so many examples. This was one of my favorites because it just struck me. I remember where I was in New York working down the street listening in my headphones when I realized she never says the word. She never says satisfaction. She never says I can get no satisfaction. But you know you're listening to that song, but she just never says it. And in a way to pull off such a cover where you're actually just somehow suggesting the main idea without really having to put it in one's face, I thought was mind-blowing. So in the lecture, in the workshop too, we kind of looked at a bunch of other examples of covers in, let's say, furniture, of course, the famous alto chair. It happens in architecture too, but less often. Product design, fashion, film, art. And I mean, Lukas knows more about this than I do because he's worked for years on this issue of originality and covers and so on and so forth. But our proposal was really to make a case for covers and really kind of use it as a humbling exercise, because in many ways it's really just rather absurd for architects to have to reinvent the wheel every single time. And these were our principles. These were just some of the examples from the students. And basically what we did is we looked at housing because we thought housing is the kind of most prototypical thing. So take floor plans of apartments and start doing covers of them. These are just examples. The U house turned into, I guess, a B house, and so on and so forth. And one of the studios was on, that I taught at the GSD, was housing for semester. We looked at post-work. Postwork.org is where you can find the projects if you want to look at them. Funnily enough, this was exactly when, or not so funny, this was exactly when we were all sent home at the beginning of the pandemic. And basically the idea is, if you live in a place not because it's proximity to your office or to work, then where do you live, how do you live, who do you live with? Of course, this happens all in parallel with the notion, too, of this integration of the nuclear family and kind of looking at social conditions and social modes of cohabitation. And then most recently, I think as of last year, started working with the Stanford Legal Design Lab. We did a seminar at GSD and a studio at MIT, and we'll continue the work with both schools. Not very imaginative when it comes to titles, as you can tell. But basically, we looked at 2 different aspects. So I don't know how much you know about the American justice system, but it's looking pretty bleak. We started, in both cases, we started with just research and trying to understand both the justice system, but also what's happening. Basically, at the beginning of the pandemic, the justice system, just like our schools, just like our work, everything was sent home. But all of a sudden, this place on which justice depends has been improvised completely. And people had to work from their laptops, from their computers, in really improvised ways. There is opportunity in things going digital. The justice system is one of the most conservative industries or places you can possibly imagine, yet they were forced into change. So then the idea was, how can you buy into that? How can you use that? And how can you be making sure that this doesn't just accidentally go even more so in the wrong direction? So a bunch of research is basically understanding that it's really, in the US you have self-litigants, meaning people who can self-represent. You can't do that in many places in Europe. But what it means is that oftentimes you have very legal aid. So for 10,000 people living in poverty, you have less than one legal aid attorney. One has to understand too that it's basically 71% of low-income households that experience at least one civil legal problem. That's a mistake there. It's not 1 in 7, it's 71. And that 86% of low-income Americans received inadequate or no legal help in 2016. We're not talking about some fringe number or the exception. We're talking about 60 million people. The other thing that's interesting, there are actually no tools, and I think this is a really fascinating problem. There are no tools to really fully understand the problem. There's no real definition of success when it comes to justice, which I think is fascinating in itself. I'll go through all of this a little bit faster. We looked at all different kind of barriers faced by the court users, and really just did a bunch of research, understanding who has access to internet, what does this whole internet actually mean from this perspective. There's digital barriers. It seems easy, but it's not necessarily. There's virtual bias. What does public mean once your whole thing goes online? All of a sudden, in your domestic violence dispute or in your divorce, you can have millions of viewers, and there are such cases. I'm sure you've watched many of those in the last year. It's a complete nightmare to try to find a form or to try to understand what one has to do when one is facing one of those issues. So we basically did two sets of things. On the one hand, first we looked at this was the seminar, so we really just paired law students with architecture students. And really the ideas that they looked at access, eviction, and then domestic violence. And the things they came up with, these that I just kind of flipped through, are really basic. It's really an app, or really a questionnaire, or really a kind of toolkit that you send at home, which seems really basic and banal, but in a way, I learned so much about architecture and architects from dealing with law students and lawyers. And partially, there were multiple things to it. I think we realized how much as architects we are trained to walk in and save the day. None of these things are going to change things. Everyone has heard of apps or questionnaires before, but there's a couple of things that are happening. The justice system is lacking resources. So that's one. And two, the problems are not rocket science. They really just require someone being able to put their mind to it and kind of think through it. And it's really so overrun with resources that just doesn't happen. So it was very humbling in that experience. And there's a few more. We also looked then at the courthouses. This was at MIT in spring. This was a quote from one of the justices, and she's very right. We looked specifically at a courthouse in Massachusetts, and it was one of the kind of craziest spaces you could possibly, very standard building, actually very standard courthouse, but also crazy in terms of how many rules, architectural rules, spatial rules, how many codes and standards they were breaking themselves. And what we did in this case, we defined what we call the blueprint. And what we realized in many of our conversations that justice and architecture are actually quite interchangeable, quite easily in many circumstances. And really trying to spell these things out. What was important to us in dealing with a piece of architecture was that we're not reinforcing the system, but that we counter it. Meaning you have things like juvenile detention. But we were not going to make a nicer juvenile detention. It was important to us to actually point towards ways in which this architecture can go towards and not allow the building to just, mindlessly reenact a system, but instead contribute to it. So we devised our own sort of programmatic understanding of it. And, one of the biggest takeaways was that currently the buildings, the courthouses in the US and the civil the social infrastructure is so thin that the courthouses just do this very narrow part of the justice system. But there's additional implications of all those elements. that basically they need to be expanded. So the courthouse needs to move on, or in general, the social net, the social infrastructure needs to become broader, so that it's not so much about, meeting the judge and going to trial, but really it's about being able to have access to all sorts of resources. Lukas mentioned non-professional practice. There was a seminar that I started a few years ago, and last year we did a piece in Volume magazine. And here is, trying to see if I can change my view here, sorry, on my screen. Basically, Lukas mentioned Benedict Cumberbatch reading Solowitz's letter. And I think it was it helped us really define a little bit the class and what non-professional means. It really just allowed us to look at different kinds of practices, not just architects. We have curators, writers, artists, architects, developers, and so on and so forth. And basically, we're just trying to understand how everyone goes about their life, but really not just the work itself, but the work behind the work. And that was a really sort of insightful, very interesting exercise. So in this piece, what we did, the students, every student picked a guest and then sent them a postcard, and there was this exchange of postcards between them. So we just kind of scanned the postcards, and the whole article is just that. We wanted to make sure the article is also not just it's a reflection of the class and of the spirit of the class, and doesn't become something that becomes super prescriptive or analytic. The letter that Lukas was talking about, that Benedict Cumberbatch is reading, is a letter by Saul Lewitz sent to Eva Hesse. You might have encountered it. But he told her to she was stuck and he was trying to help her out. And at one point he just tells her, you just have to say fuck you to the world every now and then. And I think this is something that we learn more and more in this class. I'm reluctant, and I kind of refuse throughout the years of doing the seminar to really narrow down what is a non-professional and who is this and what is that. But you can see some of the issues that are being touched upon is anything from imposter syndrome to feeling stuck, to not knowing where to go. At the bottom, the name of the artists are also written. You have Carlos Soto, you have Jim Joe, Karen Wong, and Sargent, a bunch of interesting people. And if you're interested in the subject, you can find a little bit more on it on the website. It's nonprofessional.org. We have two things happening there. On the one hand, there's some of the exercises, some of the speculative things that we're trying to do, like jumpstart, form contact, amateur, failure, investigating those issues. But on the other hand, we try to really capture the energy that is happening in the class, both through the so-called posters, both of the guests that come through, but also of the students. So you have this series of posters that you can go and look at that the students had to make on some of the guests. It's Benjamin Reihan, and this one's Jim's Joe. The thing on the right side, Jim Joe had listed these 33, that's a lecture in itself, kind of lessons that he then sent as postcards to everyone himself. But the reason, the one commonality, I think what non-professional practice allowed me really to do was work with the students, or allow us to become more of a community or a gathering space than anything else. Both in the class on Blueprints for Justice, or in both classes on the justice system, but also here, we all go in sort of blind. There's a very limited syllabus, and part of the exercise is really to all go together through the research and together be able to kind of define the problem that we're looking at, together kind of define, okay, how do we go about it, what do we want to design, what can we contribute. I think it's not easy because architecture school doesn't oftentimes work that way. It's very much about the individual, at least over there, or in my school too. So to allow everyone to kind of choose whether they want together or not, and choose to define their projects, all while having some hand-holding, that was something that was really important to me. Something else happened in that period. I got lung cancer. Don't feel too bad for me about here. I was very high, quite happy. It's true. But what's weird what happens in that, I'm always hesitating, do I talk about it or not, but it's something that I would talk about anyway, or I talk anyway. So anyway, I'm all good, healthy, lucky, got away, knock on wood. But it's weird because you're being subjected, that is me, you're being subjected to all these weird things, and these are all basically cross-sections through your bodies going both ways. My doctors were a little bit scared about how fascinated I was by the whole thing. They kept begging me not to post it or do anything with it. But it is really kind of an insane experience to go through. And I'm sure everyone had their fair share, whether direct or indirectly, of similar experiences. This happened around 4 years ago, and of course it kind of started spinning things in all sorts of different directions that I'll touch on a little bit in a little bit. What does it mean? On the one hand, it really kind of made me stop and take a step back, but on the other hand, it really makes a very kind of clear direction or like clear relationship to your body. I think it was frankly the first time where I felt as a woman that I'm not at odds or I'm not mad at my body, and you're really just kind of in awe and kind of see what it does. Having that awareness, understanding that is also kind of weird too, because then you're like, you're really understanding how you're treating yourself typically. This is a scan after they took out 2 lung lobes from my right side of the body. So anyway, that was a whole experience that really kind of made me, in many ways, I think I always talk about it because I felt it gave me courage at the time. But not courage in a sort of brave way or anything, but courage in the sense of kind of in that, there's a fine line between courage and being an idiot. And I think it's that very thin line that I'm very interested in. And it really sort of enabled something for me, a perspective, or it really kind of allowed me to dig in a little bit deeper in certain parts that otherwise I think I wouldn't have gotten to. There was a project that sort of came out of it too. It's still under construction. Of course, one looks at the lungs and tries to understand them a little bit better. And one of the fascinating things with lungs too is that any expression of any change, anything you do, anything you think, anything you feel is affected or is affecting your breathing. And it goes both ways. Any expression of emotions, but really even thoughts and so on and so forth really affect the breathing. And there's something really banal and really simple and beautiful in understanding how thin that line is and how little we are in a way and how fragile. So the project itself was a weird one, and I think it was one which couldn't typically necessarily, I couldn't explore with my typical tools as an architect, like build models and so on and so forth. But instead, explored it more so through writing. So I wrote a piece in Badlands magazine, came out last year, I believe, in the May issue, with which I really tried to explain it a little bit more. So basically what we wanted to recreate is that feeling of basically kind of, how do I best put it, learning from the structure of the lungs and really replicating them into these huge elements, so that you basically are able to sit on these giant lungs and really just experience the breathing or the sneezing or the yawning. So to give you a sense of the scale, we're looking at something like this. It's a little bit like if you held a baby and you put it on your chest, or if you lie with your head on your partner's or friend's chest. It's really just kind of trying to understand how much of that movie, can you be that tiny being, how much of that movement really kind of synchronizes between the outside and the inside. There's a whole kind of side to it that I'm not going to get into because we're running out of time, but that is tied to a music component too, particularly Glenn Gould playing the Goldberg variations. If you ever listen to them, you can hear him hum. And he always said he cannot not hum. If he doesn't hum, he cannot play. And I always wanted to listen to just his humming and not the play, not the actual music, to see if that was actually possible. But there is the relationship between the heartbeat, the music, the pillows, where you're sitting on these things, and they just enable one to be part of the breathing. And I'll just jump forward to the last part. Basically, we'll go past Perry. We leave him at the end. When I was working with the lawyers and Nora from the Stanford Legal Design Lab, they really kept asking with every design decision, they kept asking, but how do you do that? How do you make the decision? And it's really hard to explain, right? Because every decision, every design decision has like 20 implications. And you're really just trying to see how, it's not all rational, it comes and it goes. So what I did at one point, I had to design this chair for this company in the US, 909 Archive it's called. And I tried to walk them through the entire process for the project. And I'll just go through it quickly, but these are the two, there's two sketches that were left from it. But basically, we had to design a chair for $909. We had 1 month, very limited time. What was clear for me as a limit was that the budget was important, needed to work within the budget, but also that I didn't want to reinvent the wheel with 1 month of production all during lockdown in Berlin. So there's these two aspects, right? The brief on the one hand, taking the notion of the chair, trying to reinterpret it, and it was pretty clear pretty quickly to me that I wanted to make this tool. On the other hand, of course, there's all these other things that are part of your life. There's a couple of materials that I wanted to work with for a long time. I was building felt bed for my dog, because I didn't want a typical dog bed, whatever. But I also wanted it to kind of speak for a little bit that specific moment in time. This was late lockdown last year, and the sort of weird mental state that we were on. So from there, kind of eliminated some elements, so others got to it being a felt stool with some of the reading materials that would reflect that. And then from there, once you have the idea of the felt stool, let's say there's still two things. One is the concept. How do you think about it? How do you articulate it? What do you want of it? And that back and forth between that then goes back into form. So there's a whole kind of back and forth between these two elements. One thing that I wanted to do is that it would be something that allows people to interact, to really start a dialogue, to share maybe, or to somehow really create something between people. For a second, I wanted to call it I Want You to Love Me after, what's her name, the song from Fiona Apple, because her album was out that time and it was amazing and I listened to it nonstop. But I think that it raises also, I think it is true in a way, it's universal, that feeling of wanting that. So basically this was just a kind of entire back and forth of kind of constant chaos. The only point of these two slides was really just kind of trying to show the process, and it's how non-linear it is, how chaotic, how circumstantial, and how random. And the result of it was this chair, this tool that is called Feel, Felt, 1 to 40 seats for 1 to 80 people, which was just exhibited last week in LA. And as the last thing, it had the reading materials. Ended up choosing, what I wanted to do was something personal, so I ended up basically just scanning pages from books and kind of sliding them between all these seats. So the moment you kind of split it into 2 or 3 or 4 or 40, everyone takes a page, or everyone ends up with discovers some reading material. And if we still have time, I'd like to go through some of those reading materials and then leave it at that. Yeah, I'm not sure how I can do it though, because I have on the screen, I have to see the page a little bit bigger in order to be able to go through it.
Best is either that you look up there.
But then how can I can read from there, but how do maybe I can do this? No, it's a lot of reading. No, it's a lot of reading. Yes, actually. Maybe that's easiest. You can still hear me, right? Good, I don't have to. All right, this might be, I could have just done this actually for the entire lecture, but this might give you a better idea of what's on my mind and where my brain's at. Or isn't. Okay, let's try to see if this works. How do you spend your time, she said. Reading, mostly, I said. I couldn't tell her that mostly I said staring at blank walls or getting stoned into my heart, and then one day when I could finally masturbate again, making love for myself for hours at a time. Orgasms are kind of like art, I told her. You know it when you see it. It may not be what you expected, but it will be different than everything else. Nope, it didn't work. It didn't change. Thank you. If we are to explain to a significant number of people what is wrong with a discourse that places pleasure in the body in fundamental opposition to some notion of a legally constrained social responsibility, rather than a discourse that sees that pleasure and the body are constitutive elements of the social as much as our law and responsibility. As we have seen, the body was increasingly politicized in this process. It was denaturalized and redefined as the other, the outer limit of social discipline. Thus, the birth of the body in the 17th century has marked its end, as the concept of the body would cease to define a specific organic reality and become instead a political signifier of class relations and of the shifting, continuously redrawn boundaries which these relations produce in the map of human exploitations. Thank you. Much of the scientific study of sexuality has been characterized by a deep anxiety about the subjective experiences of sexual pleasure and desire, especially when it's a matter of female pleasure. Feeble-minded women were sent to the Virginia State colony for confinement to ensure that they would not continue breeding and thereby contaminate the population with further morons or idiots. When Emma Buck arrived, she was cleaned and bathed, her clothes thrown away, and her genitals douched with mercury to disinfect them. A repeat intelligence test performed by a psychiatrist confirmed the initial diagnosis of a low-grade moron. She was admitted to the colony. She would spend the rest of her lifetime in its confines. There really isn't any reason that a woman, not women, or women, couldn't take any or every role for any and every male patron. That includes the guy joking with his cousins and his cousins' friends, coming down the stairs, genitals exposed, though it does unmitigated violence to the West's traditional concept of women. But I believe it is only by inflicting such violences on the concept that we can prevent actual violence against women's bodies and minds in the political material world. I make this statement not to close off the subject, but to open it up. Those who dared refuse the gender norms and social conventions of sexual propriety, monogamy, heterosexuality, and marriage, or failed to buy the script of female respectability, were targeted as potential prostitutes, vagrants, deviants, and incorrigible children. Immorality and disorder and promiscuity and inversion and pathology were the terms imposed to target and eradicate these practices of intimacy and affiliation. Our culture teaches us to focus on personal uniqueness, but at a deeper level, we barely exist as individual organisms. Our brains are built to help us function as members of a tribe. We are part of that tribe, even when we are by ourselves, whether listening to music that other people created, watching a basketball game on television, our own muscles tensing as the players run and jump, or preparing a spreadsheet for a sales meeting, anticipating the boss's reactions. Most of our energy is devoted to connecting with others. All of us have to learn how to invent our lives, make them up, imagine them. We need to be taught these skills. We find guides to show us how. Without them, our lives get made up for us by other people. Everything that is known by the mind is an expression and reflection of its own limitation. Most minds forget their own limitations and project them instead onto whatever they know to perceive. This brings us to one of the most challenging ideas. You need an emotion concept in order to experience or perceive the associated emotion. It's a requirement. Without a concept for fear, you cannot experience fear. Without a concept for sadness, you cannot perceive sadness in another person. You could learn the necessary concept, or you could construct it in the moment through conceptual combination. But your brain must be able to make that concept and predict with it. Otherwise, you will be experientially blind to that emotion. Our brains are made so that we can only love a cat as a cat and not as a bird or an elephant. If we want to love a cat, we want to see a cat, touch its fur, hear it purr, and get scratched if we get our petting wrong. We don't want to hear it bark, and if the cat started growing feathers, we would kill, study, and finally exhibit it as a monster. I don't know why our brains are like that, but Kay has taught me that if we try to grow feathers without people expecting us to fly, they will shoot us from the sky, and their dogs will shake us to make sure that our necks are broken before we are chucked into a bag and disposed of. We are often taught that we have no control over our feelings. Yet most of us accept that we choose our actions, that intention and will inform what we do. We also accept that our actions have consequences. To think of actions shaping feelings is one way we rid ourselves of conventionally accepted assumptions, such as that parents love their children, or that one simply falls in love without exercising will or choice, that there are such things as crimes of passion. Thank you. It took me a long time, a very long time, to begin to realize that she was right and begin to realize what she meant. I, like all of us, thought I knew what I wanted, and I thought I knew who I was, and, like all of us, I thought that whatever it was I wanted and wherever I wanted to go, I could achieve without paying my dues. Whatever one's journey is, one's got to accept the fact that disaster is one of the conditions under which you will make it. The journey, I mean, not make it in the American sense. And you will learn a certain humility because the terms that you have invented, which you think describe and define you, inevitably collide with the very facts of life. When this collision occurs, and make no mistake, this is an absolute inevitable collision, when this collision occurs, like two trains meeting head-on in a tunnel, life offers you the choice. And it's a very narrow choice of holding on to your definition of yourself or saying, as the old folks used to say, and as everybody who wants to live has to say, yes. But it is because man's condition is ambiguous that he seeks through failure and outrageousness to save his existence. Because to declare that existence is absurd is to deny that it can ever be given meaning. To say that it is ambiguous is to assert that its meaning is never fixed, that it must be constantly won. In war, there is no victory which cannot be regarded as unsuccessful. So it is with any activity. Failure and success are two aspects of reality which at the start are not perceptible. That is what makes criticism so easy and art so difficult. The thing I now realize was happening during those years was a sort of taking assessment of my own sensibilities. I was, for the first time, really sitting down and asking myself some hard questions about why I liked something one way or not another. The very simple question that I asked myself about why there was so many arbitrary things in my paintings, it was just simply paying attention to my own sensibility and taking stock of it and deciding that too many things in there simply didn't make sense. Make sense on what basis? What did I mean by making sense? I really didn't have a clear idea at this time. But I had developed this notion that if I spent long enough and allowed myself to think about a particular idea hard enough, I would begin to gain some awareness or some knowledge about it. Because your mobility, your breath, and impulse have already been so constricted by earlier layers of wrapping, those previous layers that doubled as protection, as nourishment on the one hand, and restrictive social sanctions on the other, that you no longer have the dexterity or strength you would need in order to unwrap it. It may not longer occur to you that there is anything to unwrap. Like all but the most confidence-thick writers, never trust an artist who does not possess self-doubt. I understood what it felt like to be in public, tail in the air for everyone to see. Feeling stuck can stem from a fear of embarrassment, fear of censure of others for trying too hard, for being pretentious, for being blind to one's own position. Fear of not getting it, of having missed that class in which the right references were handed out. Fear of not having any right in the first place. And imagine an invisible panel of observers, superegos, wearing impress me faces, poised ready to trip the writer up. First, there's the vinegar lip reader lady who says primely, well, that's not very interesting, is it? And there's the emaciated German male who writes these Orwellian memos detailing your thought crimes. And there are your parents agonizing over your lack of loyalty and discretion, and there's William Burroughs dozing off or shooting up because he finds you as bold, as articulate as a houseplant. I hope this will be the last hate ad to be published in Flash Art, which has become a real forum for artists. It is pathetically outworn romantic notion that real artists emerge fully formed, having no traceable antecedents. The absurdity of this idea is apparent, and yet there are artists who claim this for themselves. Sorry, I'm having fun. I imagine that for you too, there must be a sentence, a paragraph, or a longer part of someone else's work that you feel you know well, you like it, you love it even. Or perhaps you don't, perhaps it hurts you, but you are nevertheless, for a complex of reasons, attached to it. Let's say that it acts upon you. You find that it has acted upon you, but it would appear that you have already also acted upon it. It addresses you, or is it that you have made it address you? And now you love you love it and are wounded by it because it addresses you, because it looks, reads, or sounds as if it was written by you. Why, after the great artists, do people ever try to do anything again? Only because from generation to generation, through what the great artists have done, the instincts change, and that the instincts change, so there comes a renewal of the feeling of how can I remake this thing once again, more clearly, more exactly, more violently. Yes. Thank you. Let's just skip this one to make it closer to the end. So I'm furious with myself that you will only partly accept this attitude. My opinion is that anything that one does is all right, and I refuse to fight for this or that opinion of the contrary. Don't see pessimism in my decisions. They are only a way toward beatitude. Please understand, I'm only trying for a minimum of action gradually. All this is very annoying. The problem, I've said it before, I'm beginning to say it again, is figuring out how to occupy the time you're alive. It's better to occupy it than to not occupy it, as sometimes it can be so captivating that you forget death. This narrow margin, this river, this trickle of water. Life is restricted to life. But I think as an artist, so to speak, you have to accept that some part of you is going to die every time you make something that's worth making. That's where your skin is in the game. That is, to me, the choice you make. If you go down this path, you know it's going to take a toll, but you don't always know what toll it's going to be. Like me, personally, I can't find a partner. That's what's destroying me. I can't find a partner. I have a lot of people in my life, a lot of love in my life, a lot of friends and stuff like that, but I don't have a partner. I don't seem to be able to find a partner, and I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know if I'm picking the wrong people. I can be bending over backwards. It just seems like I'm a little fearful that that's part of my path, to be solo, which I'm not down with, I'm not happy about. I haven't been able to fully enjoy a lot of my recent success because I don't feel like I have anybody to share it with. I'm happy, I love Gavin, he's great, I love Emily and Lucy, they're great, and I've got so many friends, but man, I just don't seem to be able to find a partner, and it's wearing on me, man. It's really, really wearing on me. It's the one thing that really disturbs me about the whole thing. Because everyone in the class, literally everyone, all 12 people, say that getting married was the most important thing we've done in our lives. I want to say getting out of bed this morning. I want to say doing K with Hazel at a club in Queens last weekend when we locked ourselves in the single-user bathroom and peered at each other through either side of the legs of a chair that were in the corner, curled up on the floor, each of us saying how much our friendship was a monument, how we helped each other survive, blowing ketamine off her cell phone, and texting Rovina and telling her to come in the club. There was one more, but it's fine. But you know, we're all very impermanent. We are not here that long. And I don't have any control over rumors, but rumors are actually here a very long time. You should keep speaking. We should keep speaking, though. You should keep asking questions and researching and continuing to collect your stories. You should keep doing it for years, but then you shouldn't write your book. There should be no reason to write a book. Don't you know chasing these stories is what it is? That's it. Thank you. I'll just say one word before if you're still here. Thank you for indulging me in this. So it's kind of becoming, I guess, or whatever, a book of books. But the reason I was trying to play with it a little bit, a year or two ago, scientists discovered that this space in between our organs is technically an organ in itself. And I find it very fascinating because we just don't think of organs typically that way. That's why we didn't understand it. And I started during the pandemic because of friends and family and work and so on and so forth. This is how I started thinking about us as people too. That the space in between us is as important as in a way what's inside it. And maybe the body has a kind of, this is not going to fly in the last 10 seconds, but what I'm trying to say, I think there's a whole ebb and flow in terms of energy and exchange that is happening between people, and that the limits of our bodies are misleading in many ways. And that's it. I don't know if any of it makes any sense.
So thank you so much, Oana. Actually, let's skip to the next image, and then we have you, thank you, and then this. So yes, thank you. This was wonderfully puzzling. Also, the last.
You asked for a lot.
The last part. It's a beautiful cutout too. That you took it like very literally. I have a few questions, but I want to also give you the chance to ask questions. I mean, you showed a very broad range of works, from a chair to a half-a-kilometer bridge. Should I break the ice? Or do you already have a question? Oh, now I'm... Break the ice? Okay, so you, in a way, beautifully described architecture also as an art of negotiation. There's a lot of people at the table that you have to work with, collaborate with. This is very much also about kind of learning how to collaborate, how to work with other people from different disciplines. And in preparation of today's talk, I read an interview actually in the Pinup magazine. The new editor is with us here today, where you said that none of the issues we're facing globally right now can be tackled by a single profession, nor without the kind of collaboration enabled by technology. In a way, that's exactly the point that I'm trying to make with this lecture series here. But could you elaborate on this once more?
Well, I think for many years, we actually looked at it in non-professional practice a lot, this idea of the specialization, right, of the specialist coming in and saving the day. And I think we all realize right now everyone's so specialized that no one can actually deal with let's say, complex problems anymore. And that's a form both of gatekeeping and keeping people out of certain professions or out of certain issues. But truly, I think some humbleness would also not be lacking in terms of kind of people being more willing and more able to actually sit together. Like, for example, in architecture schools, they always pride themselves on multidisciplinarity, but that's not really what's happening. It's being called that way, but it actually really stops fairly short of that. And for me, it's really, for me, what's fascinating is just how fluid ideas can go between whatever field or, between the different things. With the lawyers, for example, I think we were always very shy, and we got very excited. We recognized architecture as being part of the problem. But then everyone kind of got really depressed because we couldn't see it as part of the solution, which I thought was very ironic. But it's because we were so trained to kind of be the only solution. But the lawyers also told us law will never fix the problem. So architecture won't either. But maybe together we're more able to do it.
And having worked with a lot of, as I can mention, a lot of egos around the same table, what's your trick? Like how do you, like, what's your role in this, and how do you manage this amount of, as I imagine, ego and kind of very strong ideas and conceptions?
Read them 20 pages. I mean, I think if you want to design properly, to me, design is an intimate act. And if you want to sit around the table, and I feel any artist I encountered or any creative person I encountered that had the intention to create a project had to leave ego outside of the door. You need to feel comfortable to say potentially stupid things. I mean, all great ideas sounded like really terrible pitches or stupid ideas in the first place. So I think this is write this one down. Yeah, this was very, very, very smart. But it's true. It's one needs to have trust in the people at the table, and really that's all that comes down to. And yes, everyone has egos, but I think there are ways to counter or to work against that. I mean, in architecture school, ego is inoculated into you, which is kind of absurd if you think of it, because out of all art forms, it's the most prescriptive. I mean, a door, a window, so on and so forth, also in this construction process, but it doesn't get you very far. So once I mean, it's like sports in many ways, or team sports. You need one another, and you need the other person's brain to push your idea further, and so on and so forth. So once you're able to establish that trust and that way of playing, ego has very little to do with that. Beautiful. So did I break the ice? Again, she made it. Yeah, please.
Yeah. Thank you so much for your lecture. It was really insightful. And I just wanted to ask you about the piece that you wrote in Batman about your health experiences. I actually happened to have read it and forgot about it, but now I remembered. And I only remember vividly that it was quite scattered, the text somehow. It wasn't very linear to me. That's what the impression I took from it. And I was just wondering if you could expand on how this literary excursion informed your architecture project that came out of it, and if you have experience with writing accompanying your
Before you answer, Oana, because the sound is not so strong for the online audience, I will quickly repeat. The question was that the text that you also presented quickly that you wrote for Badlands, in which you talked about your health condition and the lung cancer that you fought and won, and that the text was also in this kind of scattered way, and how this stands in relation to also the project that evolved out of it.
Yeah. Thank you for the question, and thank you for reading the piece. I do write, but I would be embarrassed to call it a writing practice, because I think English is a foreign language to me. Currently, all languages are foreign to me, for that matter. So, and I never, studied writing. So for me, it's more, let's say, a hobby or something that I do for pleasure, but something deeply necessary. And the piece in Badlands had basically two linear trajectories. On the one hand, it was the description of the process, that you enter the space, and then you lie down, and then this thing starts moving with you. And then in parallel, it was like mini kind of episodes that were trying to put it into perspective. Because it's hard, like with experiential things like that, it's really hard to translate. And I realized, we walk into the office of a structural engineer or the kind of company that we work with to build that, and it always starts with, I had lung cancer, and then I had a baby lion, and she slept on my chest, and you end up having all these stories in order to really just explain a very basic thing. So I found that writing was an easier way to translate it than to just put a balloon in front of someone and kind of show that it works.
Yes, please.
What did architecture mean to you when you were first in school? What did architecture mean to you when you first worked for a firm? And what does architecture mean to you now?
I mean, I think at its deepest depth, it's the same sort of, I still feel like the kid that just opens a door and it's like, holy shit. And it's like to discover that you can make a living. In Romania at the time, there were jobs like you could be an attorney, an accountant, or I don't know, I think that was it, an engineer. But you didn't have, let's say, creative, like to make living by writing or art just was not a thing. And so to discover that one can have this much fun making a living with was mind-blowing. But I think that fundamental just joy and excitement that every sort of project takes you down, and having, you just learn to risk more and take more chances, and kind of I feel I get to know myself more and more and more by going through a bunch of these things.
In terms of having your body, like something extracted or like contaminating your body, like killing your body, like how does it feel, or how do you relate to building these things that like will outlive you, regardless of this like intervention of the disease? But like, how do you feel about, has your relationship to building changed since your relationship to your body?
I don't know that my relationship to building has changed. I'm pretty good with letting things go, putting things out, and allowing them to have lives of their own. I'm not controlling in that sense, and I'm not that interested in that. I think my relationship to everything has changed fundamentally, in the sense that it's a lot more, I feel, laissez-faire for me. Like in a sense, like I think you just realize your place in the universe, and you realize that everything is a miracle, and you really have today, and so it better be fun. And I think architecture can be misleading in the sense that I think both, in offices or there 99% of the work happens behind the scenes, and it's really hard work. And you have, I think, then the option, and there's so much focus on the end result. But then I didn't allow that to happen anymore. So I needed to make sure that actually the 99% is as much fun or as worthwhile. And that architecture also just becomes an excuse to have conversations with people. So I try to basically, what I'm trying to do is integrate it or make the practice more part of life. I don't want to say necessarily architecture part of life, but really just the practice. So that means whatever project, whatever conversation, whatever exchange is happening. So not see it like, the book that I'm reading or the music that I listen to, I don't see them as separate anymore. I see everything can be tied with a fairly loose line into each other. And to constantly trying to find better and better tools to express those things, or to tie those different ideas together. And that's where it's at for me. But it took me a long time to get to the place to kind of see those connections being drawn.
Yes, Hassan.
So it's more about like the creative process or like what you use architecture for. Because when I came here and listened to Skepta, there's like the song where he talks about like being addicted to a certain way of pain to kind of work again, because he kind of needs it to push it himself again. So you know, this way of sabotaging yourself to get back into this work and have these 24/7 you know, weeks. So how would you describe your creative process after a project is finished, and then what do you think do you want to use architecture kind of for, other than like building and stuff?
Paul, that's a tricky one to repeat, honestly speaking. I think for the next session, lesson learned, we need a microphone. So this was started with the Skepta lyrics and like basically what do you do after a project is finished? Usually one has a blues phase, so to speak.
The idea of like sabotaging yourself kind of in this creative process.
The idea of kind of sabotaging yourself in the creative process. Also, I guess what happens after a project is finished, and what do you want from architecture beyond building?
Yeah.
Kind of. So we need a mic. So noted, juxtaposition team, we need a mic.
I think, you know, I mentioned fun, and I keep mentioning fun because I feel so many of the conversations that I have, especially with students or young people who talk about what the career path is, the notion of fun does not come in. And I understand it's dark times, but at the end of the time, you're still kind of here to enjoy things. But I also think as you enjoy things is where amazing kind of things come out of. Like, I think for me, it's all about... you know, I realized that whatever I thought was my biggest weakness ended up being my biggest asset or strength. Meaning, I think at times you think that what keeps you from fitting in is what's your weakness. But then what that means, in essence, is that that's what gives you your unique perspective onto whatever it is you're doing. And in any creative fields, it is about that unique perspective. So for me, it's all about trying to find that kind of weird little strange voice inside of you, and I think it's something that's not easy to find, because I think we're so conditioned to hide it, to put it away, to not hear it. And it's very much about just kind of trying to dig deeper and try to just find that weirdness and let it act out and let it become a thing. So the process is painful in the sense of even when I say fun, I mean it in a kind of painful way at times, because, you know, one has to really go into the flow, or one has to really work hard. I think it's a vulnerable process too, right? Anytime you build something, you put yourself out there, and it's tough. Half of the time you're thinking everything is shit, half of the time you think everything is the greatest. Like, you're kind of in between this constant sort of, but you realize that that's it a little bit. It's a little bit like surfing, which I do not do, but it's like you just learn to kind of catch the waves and to kind of navigate. Like, you go up or down or whatever. So I think the process is very much about that. It is, for me, it is about growth and about kind of finding your voice, yourself, so on and so forth, and using it as a way to make sense of the world. So architecture, I mean, for me, you know, I know architecture better than anything else, or that's for better or worse what I know how to do, and that's what I've been doing for a long time. So I think that's just something that I want to keep investigating further and see where it will take me. But I also don't know many other professions where people beat themselves so much up as architects, who study architecture and is like, oh, I'm doing whatever, 100 stores a year, but it's not really architecture. Or you hear this, but it's not really architecture so often, and I never understand it. I don't know that doctors ever say, but it's not really medicine or whatever. And there is this kind of weird complex around architects and architecture that I think one can trip over. But I feel to me it doesn't matter what box you put it in, and it doesn't, whatever it is you're doing. And the world always will want to put things into boxes for you. But I think one has to be able to make the difference between what is expected of one, what one does for others as a response, whether intentionally or not, and then what you do because that's what you want to do, or that's what you believe in. I don't know if that answers it.
Go ahead, but try to speak up really loud, so maybe the mic catches it.
I want you to define architecture in your own terms, because like architecture to me means something entirely different to you.
But in a way, it doesn't matter. I refuse to define architecture because I think, especially in school, it's one of the most common architecture. Well, what is architecture? It's like, who gives a damn? Like, why does it matter?
So what do you think that you're doing?
I'm having fun. And yes, I'm an architect, but like what you know, with the PS1 project or with some projects, I'm like, it's art, it's not really this. And I was like, I mean, I wish it was art, but I would never have the pretense to call it that. And it's like, everyone puts things in whichever box, but it's a non-question for me, because I think I see people tripping over that question. Right. So if it helps your practice, by all means, ask yourself a way, try to define it for your own terms, so on and so forth. But for me, it's a non...
But that's in a way exactly the point of this lecture series. There's now an architect next time. It's an art collective that works in between kind of real life and role game playing. And then there's a curator, and then there's a designer. And they're all kind of pushing the boundaries of what they are. And they're exactly avoiding any definition of what they're doing.
But if we were to say if it was not sexy, like what, I think like for me, like what I'm wanting to know about you specifically, which I kind of know from our conversations, but I'm like, is architecture to you when the actual building is erected, or is architecture the actual plan, like the conversation on the planning? Is architecture to you when the site is, the construction has been built, like, or is it all, does it all come into itself?
I mean, it's all... It's all and nothing. In a way, it is all. I mean, the process to get something built goes from anything, from abstract idea to like some, you know, it can take years. And I think you asked before, and not letting go and so on and so forth. Really, by the time you get something built, it's been years, and you've been seeing it through so many aspects. That's why there's so many different scales to architectures. There's so many ways of doing it. There's so many ways of inhabiting it. There's so many ways of thinking about it that it's not a limited thing to me. The only way I can say it is it's what I know how to do. And then I know I'm always trying to push myself towards uncomfortable, weird things just because I need to kind of see what's there. But
and maybe looking at the clock, and we've been here for almost 2 hours. I'm very thankful for your patience. No, thank you to you, Oana. I have many, many more questions that we will have to do maybe another time. But I'm particularly grateful that you took this really broad perspective and even started with early student projects. And that's maybe something to take from, despite all the accomplished, work that we saw today, it still started with a student project. And even your master thesis is now hopefully being realized in your hometown. So, but this is really maybe one of the main inspirations to take with you is like whatever you're doing right now is not just studies. Like take every project serious and make it something that goes into your portfolio, and maybe even in 10 years or whatever, 20 years, it will be built or it will be realized. Maybe it's in 5 years, but kind of just, you're not doing this here just for fun. I mean, usually when I come to an art school, I say everyone, if you have anything else you could do, just take that door and run out of here, because you are entering a very precarious field of work. No, it's not like you're becoming a doctor or a lawyer. So whatever you're doing, do it with all your heart and all your passion, but just stick with it. No, and it's for us. It's not about only showing the great projects we did, but really that we stick with ideas. That you took an idea that you developed as a thesis now to real life, and that's, I think, I found extremely inspirational. For the lack of a great closing, actually I would like to recite again Solvit, because that was the best one. Maybe you remember that one. But in his letter he said, don't worry about cool, make your own cool, and learn to say fuck you to the world once in a while. So thank you very much, and have a wonderful evening.